Well, it's a very warm welcome to Dzvinka Kachur, who is a Ukrainian living in South Africa. Dzvinka, nice to be talking with you to get some proper insight into what's going on in your home country. How long have you been in South Africa?
Thanks, Alec, for having me. I've been here for over a decade.
Over a decade. Why did you come here? Your parents here, or and just looking for
No,
a
I studied in the UK after I did my studies in Kyiv, in Ukraine. I did my master program in the UK and happened to meet my husband, who's very passionate about South Africa, and he is South African. Really wants to make South Africa a better country, and this was the reason why I followed him and moved to South Africa as well.
and you have family presumably in Ukraine?
Yes, I've got my parents. They still live in Kyiv, and they're currently in Kyiv. And my sister also in. She lives normally in Kyiv, but currently she fled with her children to the western part of Ukraine.
Do you contact? Are you able to be in contact with your parents and your sister?
Yes, so luckily, Kyiv and the western part of Ukraine still has a very good connection. So, unlike those Ukrainians whose parents are in Sumy region and in the Donetsk region, especially in Mariupol, connection has been really bad, and people were not able to talk to their relatives for sometimes 2 weeks. So they live with the hope that their relatives are alive, but it's very difficult to get in touch in some of the areas because of the Russian invasion.
What do your parents tell you is happening?
So in this month, because it's been quite a long time, they have learned very well to distinguish different explosions because Kiev is attacked every single day and night. So they can hear when the Ukrainian air defense system is catching the Russian bombs, and they can hear when the scouts on the ground, Russian scouts, manage to get through and they put the explosion, like they did when they actually exploded the TV tower, which is positioning at Baba Yar, the famous Holocaust place of worship. So the sound of those explosions are different. They can also hear the gunshots on the streets. Regularly, the government announced that you cannot leave your houses because there are different Russian groups in Kyiv. So we will be fetching them. So please, all civilians, stay in your apartments. So that's what they hear. They're living on the fifth floor of the multi-storied apartment, and they can hear all different kinds of explosion and learning about the war that we previously learned only from the books and from our grandparents. Now this is the reality.
They live on the fifth floor of an apartment building. That sounds quite exposed.
Yeah, so when there are sirens which go 7 to 10 times a day and also during the night, you have to move to the bomb shelter. And then when the siren stops, then you can go back to your apartment. In the last week, shops were still operating and open. So it's really the case of following the guidelines from the government all the time, depending on the safety situation and following it.
How are they feeling about what the Ukrainian government is doing?
I think they feel that Ukrainian government is very much with the population, with Ukrainian population, because my parents decided to stay in Ukraine so that because it's their land. They spent their life trying to fight for independent Ukraine when it was still a Soviet Union, and then trying to contribute to this country and building its independence. So when we hear that some people in South Africa would say that South African democracy was not delivered on a silver plate, this is exactly the case of Ukraine. And I think in that sense, I feel Ukrainian people, whether young or old, are standing on their land. They are standing for their country, for their freedom, for their democracy, and this is the reason why they are there.
And when you hear the South African government standing perhaps with Vladimir Putin and with the Russians. Uh, how how do you process that now, living in South Africa and having been here, as you said earlier, for a decade?
I feel extremely sad because while we officially do not have the reasons to say that there is an agreement between Russia and South Africa, there are so many questions on this behavior that it leaves us with assumption that something is an agreement is going on between the two countries that is not transparent and is not revealed to the country. This is exactly what was happening in Ukraine. Like in 2013, Ukrainian president has signed clandestine agreement with Putin, and we did not know about it for a long time, not for a long time, but for a few weeks until it was revealed. So I think Russia is well known for striking the agreements which are not open and transparent to the public. So when we hear that President Ramaphosa says that South Africa takes a position of neutrality, but it goes against over 20 years of South African experience in public diplomacy, it obviously leaves us with the question why suddenly South Africa is not following its constitution that is very strong on human rights, on freedom, on sovereignty, and decides to, in this specific case, to say we are taking neutrality while at the same time mentioning that war could have been avoided if NATO would hear its own leaders. So we don't call Russia to stop the invasion, which was a big principle for Mandela's time, who always said we need to stop violence, stop violence. What makes Ramaphosa stop saying these words?
So
And if we look at all the arguments, from being part of BRICS to anti-apartheid movements, none of them hold. Because if you look at the anti-apartheid movement, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. A lot of ANC leaders studied in Ukraine. Ukraine contributed significantly to anti-apartheid movements. And if you look at the BRICS countries, similarly, Brazil voted in support of UN resolution on the 2nd of March that called immediately to stop the invasion of Ukraine. But South Africa decided to keep so-called neutrality. So it once again leaves us with the questions, what kind of neutrality it is, and even more, what is it based on? Because if International Court of Justice, UN reports, UN resolutions is not enough for South Africa to call the invasion and contribute to stopping the violence, to stopping killing people, then it leaves us with the question, what is so important for South African government to protect that it sacrifices all that to stand today with Russia?
it's a very interesting point that you raised that when the former Ukrainian president that was kicked out of power by the people through a people's revolution, um, that it was later disclosed that he had a secret deal with Putin. Um, I guess what you're telling us now is, should we not be asking whether there's a secret deal with Ramaphosa?
I would think so. We know that at the beginning of December, Ramaphosa and Putin had a number of phone calls. Putin has chosen to thank South Africa during his cabinet meeting and also during 4-hour press conference on internal issues. Its opening remarks started with, "We are grateful to South Africa." No other countries have been mentioned. Obviously, like what has been discussed during those December meetings that were so important. But even if it's not has been discussed then, what holds Ramaphosa today? What is the reason? In case of Ukraine, this was energy debate. Russia has been manipulating Ukrainian authorities and the government through the gas pipe. And only in 2014, after Russia has invaded Ukraine, our government had to make those bold decisions to jump off the gas pipe and become more energy independent. It is a question of what is Russia bringing to South Africa today, because we don't see that neutrality that Ramaphosa is saying in the treatment of Ukrainian and Russian citizens either. If Russian citizens can easily come without visa to South Africa, at the time of the conflict, all Ukrainians were prohibited to come. So even those who were relatives for first 2 weeks were not allowed to apply for visa. At the moment, this has been changed, and the three embassies are taking Ukrainian citizens who are immediate relatives of South Africans or those who are permanent residents. But if Ukrainian is living here on a temporary residence, and we have those cases. For example, there are 11 researchers that are co-developing Ukrainian South African satellite, and they can't bring their wives and husbands to South Africa to stay with them. They're earning salary they can afford. So what is the reason for South African government not to allow Ukrainians to come to South Africa to stay here while Russians can come here without visa?
Some very interesting questions that you raise there. But from a broader perspective, when you read in the local media and commentators, just normal South African commentators who are saying, well, Putin is justified to invade Ukraine. The Ukrainians asked for this by suggesting that they join NATO and the EU, etc. What would most Ukrainians how would most Ukrainians respond to that kind of communication?
You see, I think Ukrainians have been very well trained on disinformation by Russian government. So in 2014 and before that, Russia has permanently manipulated Ukrainians with the language issue. Or you are pro-Ukrainian, or you are pro-Russian, or you are pro-Western. So they're looking for the divide, and they are using disinformation to manipulate it. And in South Africa, we've seen the same was happening during the nuclear deal, how easy it was to paint the nuclear energy as an energy of black people, while renewable energy as an energy of white people. The same happening with this war. Currently we say, oh, because, black population is supporting Russia and white population are supporting Ukraine, instead of saying, who is standing with the human rights? And I think on the ordinary, in everyday conversation, we can hear very strongly that those who are fighting against gender-based violence in South Africa, against poverty in South Africa, they are standing with Ukraine. And that doesn't matter whether they are black or white. So it raises even more questions. So why South African government is not standing with those who are activists on the ground? So Ukrainians really have learned to check the information and the source of information where it comes from. We had multiple initiatives, and I know in South Africa there are also a lot of initiatives, but I think the scale of fact-checking organizations and just education of citizens on how to debunk disinformation is much more progressive in Ukraine. So, for example, if we hear that Russia is claiming that Ukraine has been doing genocide for 8 years, we would go to the source and we would see, okay, so first time the narrative about mass graves that Russia is claiming they're using generally appeared in August 2021. And Russia says that those mass graves were at the territories that have been for 8 years controlled by Russia. So first official accusation from Russian government of mass graves come on the 16th of February 2022. What makes South African politicians to repeat the narrative that was promoted 16th of February 2022, just 1 week before the invasion, as a reason? Have there been UN commission? No. Have there been any external international observers from South African government? Who can prove this information? No one. So what makes you to repeat this argument? And I think this is a very good question, because if you go to UN reports, 2014, 2016 reports on Crimea, all they say, like, first of all, Russia has brought its military troops to the territory of Ukraine. So why we don't treat those documents that have been internationally approved to international observers, but we choose to listen to Russian narratives? And it's especially important, I think, because if you look at the case of war and South African embassy in Ukraine, South African ambassador has told South African citizens in Ukraine not to believe that Russia is going to invade, because they believed what Russia was saying, that Russia does not plan to invade Ukraine. So this resulted that ambassador at the time of beginning of the war was in Kyiv. All South African citizens did not evacuate, similar to many others who were recommended to evacuate in advance. So by trusting Russian government, South African ambassador and Dirko put South African citizens in a risk. What
If we
what you defend in this situation?
if we understand the source of information, I think it becomes a lot easier for us to realize what we must believe and not. Now we know in Russia, if you're a journalist and if you suggest that there is a war happening, you go to jail for 15 years. There is no more independent media in Russia. The only information that you're getting is from the state. What is the media like, or the media landscape like in Ukraine?
I think obviously Ukraine also has some challenges, but I think Ukraine made many significant progress. For example, in 2015, it made a very bold decision to open all the KGB archives to all the citizens. So this allowed every citizen or researcher or media person to go back and to read on what was happening during Second World War, during Holodomor, and to get a better understanding of the history. So there is a massive difference on how Ukrainians understand their history and Russians, because for like in 2005 there was massive discovery of Holodomor, and Holodomor was a man-made famine organized by Stalin on a territory of Ukraine that took lives of 3 to 7 million of Ukrainians. For the whole 70 years until Ukrainian independence, it was prohibited to even mention such things. So while those stories would exist in a very reduced way as a family histories, even grandparents would be scared to tell those stories to their children, fearing that they might be sent to Siberia or repressed. So obviously, Ukraine went a long way into rediscovering its past, its history, and understanding its present. Ukraine has relatively free media and multiple different opinions.
When we read the reports coming from the international media, and we are a partner with the Wall Street Journal, this morning, for instance, the Wall Street Journal reported that there are approximately 40,000 Russian troops that have either been killed, wounded, or defected, or surrendered, or been captured. Now, this is a huge number, one fifth of the total of the invasion force, of an invasion which was only supposed to last a few days. And the world is looking at Ukrainians and saying, how are these people so resilient? What are they? How come they've stood up against this invading force, against these incredible odds? But more than that, that they've stopped the war from being lost in just a few days, as everybody had anticipated it would. What is it about Ukrainians? What it is about your people that has it pulled off this miracle so far?
I think it's an iteration of Russian aggression. Like in 2005, when Ukrainians came to the street to stand for their freedom against the falsified elections, the belief was, we are standing here, we've spent almost 100 days standing in the winter in minus 20 on a street peacefully for independent elections. Once the proper government will be elected, our situation will be sorted. Very quickly we learned that there is not no such things as a proper government, because there are so many influences that the government will be moved different directions. So in 2013, when pro-Russian president made again the deal with Russia and went against the parliamentary decision to sign agreement with EU, because the parliament has voted that the president has to sign this agreement, then the prime minister arrived to the signing place and suddenly said, we're not going to sign it, without revealing that they've received $15 billion, or were promised to receive $15 billion from Russia. So Ukrainians went on the street again to defend their freedom, their democracy, their choices. And that was revolution of dignity. This time around, the pro-Russian forces responded with a lot of violence. But even not that. After that, Russian invasion on the territory of Ukraine, taking over Crimea and eastern part of Ukraine, that's really served as a vaccination against Russian military invasion for both, for Ukrainian people and I think for other countries outside of Ukraine. Because in a short period of time, Ukrainians that didn't really have army because nobody was planning to fight have built that army. And for 8 years, we were building Ukrainian army. For 8 years, volunteers around the world and in Ukraine were making sure that this army is strong. They were learning how to debunk disinformation. So all Russian threats, cyber attacks, disinformation, paramilitary groups, were suddenly, we learned how to work with them. So it's not like Russia has now suddenly started to invade and we didn't know what would happen to Ukrainian territory if Russia takes over. Like people didn't know when Donetsk and Luhansk were walked in by Russian military troops. People thought, okay, maybe we're going to be, in line with Russia. Suddenly people are tortured. They have no freedom. No one wants to be in the shoes of Donetsk or Luhansk Republic because they have no choice. Also, Russia has moved significantly towards totalitarian society, and Ukrainians don't want that. We've already spent 2013, we've lost 100 lives on the streets of Kyiv not to be in a totalitarian society. Now, we also have responsibility for those people who lost their lives then to defend our country. So at this situation, everybody feels that we are standing for Ukrainian country, for our country, because if Russia going to take over, it's not about NATO or about anything else. Putin has clearly mentioned in his article that he published in July 2021 that Ukrainians don't exist. Ukrainians in Kremlin's ideology do not exist. So unless all Ukrainians are killed, Putin is not satisfied. And that's what gives Ukrainians superpower to stand against significantly stronger army. Because Ukrainians are standing for their freedom, for their democracy, for their life, for the life of their children. And it's a very different conversation. And that's why even more painful to hear South African positioning, completely ignoring Ukrainian agency and the fight that Ukrainians have for our freedom, thinking that this is a dialogue on a larger geopolitical scale.
But it is an ANC position. It's not a South African position. Certainly, the opposition political parties have come out very strongly, the Democratic Alliance, and then this morning, Action SA, to say that they stand with the Ukrainian people. And their surveys show that most South Africans understand what Ukraine is going through right now and relate to the Ukrainian struggle, which is similar to what was experienced in this country. But the people of Ukraine, the people in Ukraine, who are now looking around, no doubt, or one day will be looking around and saying, "Well, who came up and helped us, and who was not with us, who was against us?" Are they looking at this country with disappointment?
Yes, I think obviously maybe Ukrainians are so much caught up with the fight that they don't necessarily actively following. But if I'm mentioning to any of my friends who are in Ukraine that South African government does not support Ukraine, they just can't believe it, because it's such a violation of all human rights, of any international principle. What Russia has done, they violated all nuclear principles, all sovereignty principles, so all the basics of international law. What would make any independent government to stand today with Russia? And we know, like, the countries that support, that are standing with Russia, that vote with Russia, are very far from independent or strong economies or looking after their people.
How do you see this all ending?
I think Russia's going to disintegrate. It's probably going to last for a few more months. But the Russian losses are very high, and we can expect also that the Russian oligarchs will start fighting back, and Ukraine will regain its territory. The question is not how it's going to end. The question is when. And the more international community is waiting with condemnation of Russia, the longer it takes, the more civilian deaths it's going to take. And we can see how the war has shifted, how Russia really goes for civilian apartments, killing civilians, children, hospitals. At the moment, it's a very, very difficult to observe every single day, as we know so many people will be killed every day.
And the president of Ukraine, does he have the admiration of the Ukrainian people in the same way as it appears as though people internationally are applauding him?
I think so. I think so. Obviously, he was elected by 73% of Ukrainian population, and I did not vote for him. I was not supportive of President Zelensky. I thought it was quite a manipulative way of being associated with people, and that's why people supported him, because the way he spoke, everything seemed to be easy to be resolved. His approach was, we're going to look into eyes of President Putin and we're going to stop the war. So everything seemed to be easy. We're just going to say no to oligarchs. We're going to look into Putin's eyes and everything will be resolved. But we can see how that his approach turned really to be his strong superpower, because currently lots of people are associated with him. President Zelensky has a massive support of 93% of population at the moment in Ukraine. And the same 93% of population feel that there can't be made compromise on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So it's not a question of let's make a quick peace and we can move on. Ukrainians understand if Russian military forces are not moved out, the price that already has been paid will be even higher, because Russia is going to come back, regroup, and continue. Because we've seen that 2004, 2013, and now 2022. It's just a continuation of that attack on Ukrainian sovereignty. So it did not stop. And there is no other solution than to push Russia back.
Dzvinka, what is your day job here in South Africa?
Before 1st of March, I was a researcher at the Stellenbosch University. I looked at the Russian involvement in Southern Africa and disinformation. But as the war started, I'm fully involved in supporting Ukrainian community and Ukrainian Association of South Africa to respond to this crisis. So what we've tried to do is to call on South African government to condemn Russian invasion through protest and petitioning, and also through meeting with different civil society organization and explaining what is happening in Ukraine. So because there is maybe not that much natural connection and not so many Ukrainians and South African are close friends to explain what is happening on the ground. We're also trying to arrange humanitarian aid, and we've partnered with Gift of the Givers, a South African organization that are helping us to organize humanitarian aid, because humanitarian crisis is really enormous. We have 3 million of people that have left the country, but another almost 7 million that were internally displaced, like similar to my sister that moved to the western part. So those people that left with nothing, and often their houses have been destroyed. The need for medical aid and also so many enterprises are not functioning. Fields are not been growing food. The bakeries are not baking bread. So there is a just enormous amount of suffering that we can see. And we believe that South Africans can support Ukraine in this difficult time, because the scale of this crisis is massive, and it's going to massively impact also African continent. And the third one, we are trying to negotiate the change of the visa status for Ukrainians, because we believe that those Ukrainians who are in such a difficult situation have the right to come to South Africa and stay here, even if it's fully sponsored visa. We have the case where the NGO from Hasekwa, from Riversdale, has been partnering with Ukrainian organization in Voznesensk for 20 years. Every year, people are going to visit each other from South Africa to Ukraine, from Ukraine to South Africa. Now, Voznesensk has been bombed. It has been in the news all over. People run away. South African NGO says, we want to bring 4 people from Voznesensk to South Africa. The leader of NGO is deeply supportive of ANC. Even with all his connection, he could not help them to get visas because South African government denied them. So even this would be fully funded visa, they would be able to work here in South Africa. South African government did not allow that. We believe this is absolutely unacceptable and this needs to be changed.